starting in the 1920s, what you have is, of course, Jewish autonomy culturally. So they have that identity. They're citizens of the country. Many of them serve in the military, although not as officers generally. You have Jewish politicians, a very small number. I mean, they lived in the country, they're part of the landscape, but they're certainly not us. I think that feeling probably persisted. There is a very specific Lithuanian Jewish identity which comes in the name of Litvaks. Now, Litvaks are a very specific Jewish subculture, and they are proud of this identity as part of being Litvaks. And the word Litvak obviously comes from Lithuania. And you have to go back, I think, even to the 19th century, because you have two societies which, as Isaac Bashevis Singer pointed out, lived next to each other but not with each other. Not with each other culturally, spiritually, linguistically even, to some extent. The relationships were almost entirely economic in nature. In 1918 emerges the beginnings of an independent Lithuanian state for the first time in over a century and a half. But this time, this is a state that's going to be controlled by the majority population, which is Lithuanian speaking. And what you have is a very rapid seizure of political and eventually social economic control by this emerging majority. There's a growing anti-Semitism. And after 33, 34, of course, this is coming in part also from Germany. And so there is some, I wouldn't say predominant influence, but there is some influence coming from Germany in terms of saying, look, the Jews are the same everywhere. They want to control the economy. We should fight that. So by the late 1930s, I think it's fair to say that the situation was becoming more tenuous for Jews. 38, 39, what is happening, the war comes. And suddenly many people in Lithuania realize that the independence of the country probably is in threat. And they say, look, the only way Lithuania can regain independence is a war with the Soviet Union from Germany. And so that narrative becomes more intense. And meanwhile, it corresponds to, inside Soviet Lithuania, a growing dissatisfaction with the Soviet regime. The Jews are blamed for being communist because they are now more visible in government and the Soviet structures. And you can actually see in memoirs of Jewish citizens in 1940, 41, both in archives, in letters, and in memoirs, this saying that's repeated several times that I've seen, we are sitting on a powder keg. And then in, of course, June 22nd, it blows up. In particular, since Lithuania is a somewhat unique case in terms of who the perpetrators were, number one, how the killing was carried out, and what was the reaction of the society to what was happening. The genocide of the Jews really begins in the summer and fall of 1941 in Lithuania. Somewhere in the middle of August 1941, there is a sea change, a quantum leap in terms of the Nazi attitude towards how they're going to solve their so-called Jewish question. Because until about early August of 1941, I would say about at least 90% of Lithuania's Jews were still alive, persecuted but living. By the end of October, early November, about 2/3 of them were dead, beginning in the first weeks of July and then gradually built into this huge wave of unprecedented genocide and accelerates right through the great action of October 28th, 29th in Kaunas 9th Fort, the single bloodiest day in Lithuanian history. There's nothing like this. There's no parallel to this thing. Lithuanian Jewish life, such as it had existed since the 14th century, 15th century, particularly 16th century, for the hundreds of years, really is dealt an unrecoverable blow. When the killings begin on a massive scale, again talking about the late summer of 1941, that the majority of the actual killers, trigger pullers, if you will, are Lithuanians. Granted under German control, but still. And talk about the process, we mustn't forget of what that actually means. When you have people brought to a pit and they are murdered over the period of, let's say, 4 or 5 hours on one of these large operations, where several thousand people are shot at once, think of the blood. Think of what that means in terms of disposal of bodies, the suffering, the brutality. I know this is brutal talk, but you have to imagine what that means, to not just put a number on it, or not just some sort of, genocide as a process that historians talk about, but the actual killing of people. What we have then, beginning in August, you have from mid-August to about early October, the intense killing process. And by late October, I think it's safe to say that provincial Jewry, that is the core of Litvak culture, which is small towns, shtetls, communities, is essentially destroyed. And the Jews are driven into the bigger ghettos, which is Kaunas, Vilnius, Šiauliai. As far as people who went to Germany, this is a very sad story. Obviously, the survivors in Germany, and the Dachau thing is one of the ways in which people survived, through Stutthof perhaps, and then on to Dachau. These people were, of course, quite pained and extremely upset, to say the least, about what their fellow citizens had done to them. And needless to say, their extraordinary anger expressed itself in stereotypes of Lithuanians as killers of Jews, and demands for retribution and all the rest. And in a few cases, there are people who said, I don't want to ever go to that land again. This is not mine. This is only in my memories. I will break all contact with that land of blood and so on. See what they've done to us. This is a very painful part of the history of survivors who, have lost everything and now have turned in psychologically against the land which meant so much to them at one point.